Welcome to another edition of 1 in 15. As ever, I'm going to get my guests to introduce themselves. Hi, my name's Andy Campbell. I'm a life coach, trainer in first aid for mental health, speaker, trainer and facilitator. That's great, Andy. Nice to have you. As ever, you know that the purpose of 1 in 15 is for our guests to think about the one thing that's been dominating their thinking. What's that one thing been for you? Yeah, thanks. Well, I've been listening to the 1 in 15 podcast. And I've got some reflections on what those big things are and maybe what we could do in response to those big things. That's excellent. Why don't you tell me some more about that? Sure. Well, I mean, it's been interesting listening to the series. I've lost count of how many guests you've had now. But what's been really interesting is that as diverse as some of the themes have been, there have been some constant connections in all of them. Everyone's been thinking about something that has dominated their thinking to some extent before the pandemic, but has absolutely been affected by the effects of that pandemic. So, for example, our very first guest, we had Susan Murray, who's a stand-up comedian and promoter of live comedy. And her reflection was that live comedy, as had been done for as long as she could remember, just stopped during the pandemic. We were speaking to her just as lockdown had started, and live comedy couldn't happen anymore. So her and her peers were having to wrestle with how could they capture the essence of what they do, but do it in a new way, reach the same audience, but in a new way, and hopefully reach a new audience. And other people had parallel issues going on. Again, issues that had been perhaps bubbling away on the essence of things. So with Susan, those issues were live comedy had an issue with access for people increasingly getting their experiences online anyway. People working longer hours, cost of living, people being hit by austerity, some of those luxury items of attending a live comedy perhaps not as accessible as they had been anyway. So that comedy industry had been affected by that, but then the pandemic was brought along and made things a lot worse. Okay, so I see what you're saying, that that some of these issues had pre-existed the pandemic, but the pandemic had accentuated them. And that makes me think about some of the other guests that we had, people talking about issues of community care, communication across communities, of how we treat each other, the respect we show, of how we struggle when we're struggling and how we come out of that struggle, and about perspective. It was really interesting. I remember a couple of our guests were talking about issues to do with mental health or in and around mental health. Again, issues that maybe precipitated that pandemic, but were absolutely amplified by that pandemic. And our kind of joint reflection was that we had to think about how we manage those things in normal times, as well as how that accentuation of it during the pandemic meant that it was a bit more urgent, perhaps, or at least it felt a bit more urgent, or at least that some of the tools, some of the resources we might be able to draw on either weren't there or were accessible in new or different ways. Yeah, that's right. So it wasn't just issues to do with personal mental health or well-being, but of course we had some conversations with church leaders, with charity leaders, with coaches and counsellors who were all wrestling with that, both the accessing of that pre-existing help where it had been identified, accessing new help that people either hadn't realised they needed before, that the pandemic had brought out of them, or accessing that pre-existing help in new ways. And it was really interesting, like particularly during the early days of that lockdown, got a lot of friends in the church circles, for example, church leaders, where for as long as I can remember being involved in and around the edges of church, there's been an understanding that church has been way beyond that Sunday morning or that Sunday evening service, that physical gathering of people. And people have always understood that in theory. People have always argued for that in theory in different ways. And but obviously there's been periods of time, 4 weeks, 4 months at different points of view, where that physical meeting hasn't been able to happen. Particularly in the Christian context, in the Christian faith context, Easter was one of the first areas to happen that had a massive impact in how we always did things was no longer possible. So churches would often have traditional, quite big services, quite a big deal, perhaps something in the public square as well. But that suddenly that we couldn't meet in public. If we weren't part of a sport bubble of 6 people, we couldn't meet. So all of those events, all of those big plans that maybe been planning for since the previous Easter, suddenly just stopped. And some churches had had the capacity to respond to that really, really well. So some churches had the physical equipment already in place. Some churches had congregations that were used to meeting online in some capacity. Other churches that was almost impossible, and other churches it has been actually impossible. So I do know of churches where there has been effectively no physical meeting at all in the last 6 to 9 months, and where there's been few, if any, online meetings because their congregations either don't have the capacity for that in terms of equipment or skill or the inclination, or perhaps they're going somewhere else where those things are more accessible. And so church leaders, again, as a particular example, have had to relearn old skills or have had to learn new skills and had to reimagine who they are and how they do their role. Yeah, I've had those. I think of that too, and of course you're right that there's that has affected much more than just some of those things that traditionally would have been on in person have become online. So in terms of how families interact, in terms of how work is being done, all these things. Now, for some of us, it's been a relatively straightforward transition. Some of us who are internet savvy, who perhaps spend quite a lot of time for work or pleasure purposes online, and engaging with that kind of technology. The Zoom meetings that we're having now, those kind of things are second nature to a lot of us. But even then, there's been this infrastructure change that's had to happen. We're really mindful living in London that for a long period of 2020, there's been empty offices all over the place, or there's been offices with a real skeleton crew. And that's having, of course, a massive impact, not just only on how things are done now, but how things might be done in the future, because people are beginning to quite rightly question, well, why do I need to be in the office? What is the actual benefit for me, other than that I am seen there and I am working there, I'm being seen to work? What is the benefit for me? And again, that's been an interesting reflection with some of the guests, because we've all understood the kind of the balance of personal time and community time, and we all miss that kind of community, whether it's physical or otherwise, that the pandemic has kind of taken from us. But it's been really, really interesting from a work perspective, from a business perspective, to talk to people who are wrestling with that. It's like how do we get a community, a cohesive workforce together in a way where they work together, they benefit from each other, they have that kind of deeper relational level of understanding, so that the better work can come out of it. And obviously, one of the things that's been really, really missing from that has been those, I guess, we always used to call the water cooler moments. There's been no physical water cooler to gather around, and those kind of Zoom chats, those Zoom catch-ups, those Zoom cup of tea breaks, they don't work in quite the same way. The conversation, in my experience at least, and talking to other people, is that those conversations are a little bit more stilted. It feels a little bit more forced. It's not as reactive as it is other times. The best conversations you quite often have with people at work are the conversations you have with somebody who you don't normally see very often, or you haven't seen for a while and you're just kind of catching up, or you just happen to bump into them by the photocopier and ask about something that you both are interested in. And those kind of conversations we can't manufacture, not authentically. They're never quite the same. So what do we do about that? Sure. Well, I mean, what we do about that on one level is a relatively straightforward question, is that we do what we can and we acknowledge that we can't do everything as we used to do it, and that we may never do it again. So think about the kind of community questions that you're asking about, those conversations that we have with people, that are more spontaneous, that are more on one level, on a kind of superficial themselves, but that actually educationists, sociologists, and actually our own experience tells us that these are the lifeblood of community. These are the lifeblood of relationships. The friendships we form with people are often formed over time, gradually. They're often formed by shared experience, and sometimes that shared experience is a big thing. So we've reflected a couple of times on the issues of communitas, that kind of the community that's gathered together during a shared experience, sometimes traumatic, like a pandemic, sometimes more just unique to them in some way. So you've had an experience that nobody else has had, or that nobody else has quite had in the same way that you have. So, for example, a group of expectant mums may share the journey of their pregnancy together, and they may form a bond with each other because they understood, they had an empathy and a sympathy, for their other pregnant mums in that community that nobody else would have at the time. So they understood, when they were experiencing morning sickness, when they had complications, when they were struggling with sleeplessness or whatever it is, they all understood that. They had a shared experience, and that brought out a depth of relationship that they might not have had with somebody else in quite the same way. And we're missing that at work, to be sure. Those of us who've had experiences working in offices, we're no longer having that kind of shared experience of people, of people's lives in the same way, in the trivialities as well as the important things. And again, like we said, you can manufacture that to some extent, but it's always going to be a slightly, it's going to feel manufactured, it's going to feel slightly fake, because we're having a spontaneous conversation because it's been scheduled at that particular time. We're talking about trivialities because that's what we are at that point assigned to do or expect to do, or that's an agenda item even. And it's not quite the same. The only way to guarantee not having fun is to tell everyone that now what we're going to do is have fun. Okay, so what I'm hearing is this really, and I guess it's really obvious to say it, that life will never quite be the same again, but that we need to try and work at manufacturing, and it might feel inauthentic to start with, but we need to keep working at trying to create community, create relationships, or create the space for that community and relationships to form. And that some of the ways that we assumed these things were done are no longer possible, at least in the short term, and perhaps we just won't want to return to them. What things, thinking back over some of the interviews, what things strike you as being consistent across those people that we talked to, across the context that they were talking about, across the issues that they were talking about? Where are the consistencies in terms of how we go forward from here? Sure. Well, I guess that there's a few that I saw, actually, a few patterns of consistency that I saw across those contexts that you've talked about. The first one for me is the importance of acknowledging that a seismic change has happened. Now, most of us have done this to some extent, but it's been quite a drawn out process, I think. And there's nothing stronger, maybe, than the human capacity to be in denial. So there's certainly ways in which we could probably still reflect on ourselves as individuals, on our families and the relationships and the rituals that they're in, and again, on our places of work and places of socialization, where we need to just acknowledge that this has been a traumatic year. Everything went up in the air. All the plans that we made suddenly were no longer possible or needed to be reimagined. All the assumptions that we made about how life was going to be had to be checked, even down to things like holidays or toilet paper. These things that we kind of assumed were okay. That we'd had a pattern of things. Every year some of us went away during the summer. We knew that if we popped to the shops, certain things were going to be available, and those things were taken away and they were no longer available. And one of the ways to get through trauma is to acknowledge the reality of its impact. So, and one of the ways, conversely, to not cope with trauma very well is to pretend that you're not affected. And so that's been an important work in progress. And I think probably for most of us, it's a work that needs to carry on. We won't have resolved all of that. And for some of us, arguably perhaps particularly when the vaccine's properly rolled out, and when kind of there's a suggestion, there's a hope that life might return to something like whatever normal is going to be, that might be when the impacts of that trauma hits us the hardest. Because when we return to some things that we've given up, it might be then that we really notice the impact that their absence has had on us. And it might be we've been coping in different ways, or feeling like we're coping in different ways. But that when those things return to us, the capacity to engage with those things returns to us, that might be when the impact hits us the hardest. So that's the first thing, that we need to acknowledge that it's been a traumatic time. And secondly, we need to do what we can as individuals and as communities to honestly engage with the fact that hope is an ever-present concept, that even in the darkest of times there's some light. And to what's been really interesting thinking about all the interviews that we've done is, we've talked about some pretty stark things, but again, back to Susan, the first one we recorded, this thing of, everything she was trying to do had to stop, and she had to reimagine. And I know that's been an ongoing struggle for her. I know that she's not solved everything, but I also know that some 6 months on now, she's she's put on some live shows that they've been warmly engaged with, and things are looking up. It's not perhaps where it wants to be yet. In that industry, there's a long way to go, and of course, there's a lot of other people who've been really really affected in that kind of creative industry. So they're thinking of the theatres, the orchestra members who are working in Amazon warehouses at the moment, all those kind of things, or not working at all. So, so whilst we acknowledge the trauma and we acknowledge the impact of things stopping or having to be reimagined, we also need to look for those seeds of hope. And it was really, really encouraging all the way through those interviews to have that hope just shining through. I know that you used to say to the interviewers, the one condition you have, the one caveat you have for them is that they bring some of that hope, some of that possibility. And what was really really interesting was we never had to wait to the end of the interview for that hope and possibility to come out. It was never an afterthought. It was always innately in the conversation, even in the conversation about the really really hard things. There was always this kind of thread, sometimes really thin, sometimes a bit brighter and shinier and firmer, but there was always this thread of hope coming through, that we've got through things before and we will get through things again. And this is an interesting reflection, I think, about for some of us who've had trauma previously, or perhaps we've had mental health issues, and we've lived in a state of uncertainty, or in a state of more conscious uncertainty perhaps than some others have for some time. And my personal reflection, my personal engagement with people has been really interesting, is that a lot of people in that category, myself included, have found that because we've had to have strategies of coping with change, we've had to have strategies of coping with not knowing what's going to happen the next day, of not knowing who we're going to be like the next day, of not knowing what kind of capacity we're going to have to do things or feel things or think things the next day. In a weird way, we've been better prepared sometimes for the impacts of the pandemic, because the trauma is something that we've lived with, not on this scale perhaps, or sometimes perhaps on a bigger scale, depending on people's conditions and situations. But that reality of living in an uncertain time has been our reality for some time. And that's part of the hope for me, weirdly, is that strategy, which is really quite hard. No one would wish a mental health condition, a poor mental health condition on anyone. No one would wish trauma on anyone. But in a weird way, that is where the hope is rooted, is that experience of knowing that, acknowledging the pain, acknowledging the trauma, acknowledging your weakness, acknowledging where you need help, acknowledging where you have capacity, acknowledging where you need to find capacity from somewhere else or someone else. That is often where that hope is formed, because then you can go, well, do you know what, we have been through some pretty horrible things before. We have come out the other side. We've come out different. We've come out hopefully stronger in some ways, but with scars, absolutely. But we're still there. We're still fighting for things. Brilliant. Well, I mean, I get, as with all these things, I'm not quite sure what time we've got, so we're probably going to start wrapping it up now. What I'm hearing is that it's been a difficult year for everyone, but actually there's been real seeds of creativity. There's been real seeds of hope. There's been real seeds of being prepared to reimagine what the future might look like. And I suppose from what you're just saying, that one of the important things will be to recognise that we can't go back. We can't go back to pre-pandemic way of looking at the world. We can't go back to all of those assumptions, certainly, that we had previously, where we expected certain things to work in particular ways. What are your closing comments about, where that hope, where that possibility, where that next step is for people? Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, what's the next step? It is the $6 million question, isn't it? When I was a youth worker, that was one of the things I always used to say to the students, particularly those when they were going through kind of exam times or kind of other key decision times, was that what defines you will not be the last step you've taken, but will be the next step. The next step is always the most important thing. So people may have really really struggled with their GCSEs, but actually their next step is the thing that maybe can steer them back into a place of hope and possibility. People may have done really well at those stages, but if they take a careless step, or a foolish step, then likewise that can really, really impact where they go. So that next step, I think, if you're listening to this and you're somebody who's still struggling with recognizing the trauma of things, then one of my pieces of advice is find someone to talk to about that. It can be a formal or an informal conversation. It might just be um, in a pub, if you're allowed, over a substantial meal, of course, or over Zoom, or just at a bus stop with a friend, wherever and whenever it can be, and just say to be as honest as you can and say, it's been tough, hasn't it? Um, and to not try and kind of push that pain and that disappointment and the difficulty away, not try and hide it or pretend that it's not there. So the way to deal with trauma, or certainly the way to start dealing with trauma, is normally to bring it into the light and acknowledge it for what it is. But also make sure that those conversations are peppered with hope and possibility. So as you're acknowledging where it's been hard, where it's been difficult, where it still is hard and difficult, and also talk about some of the things that you've seen that are beautiful, some of the things that you've seen that are hopeful, some of the ways that you've experienced other people's generosity or kindness, or you've been able to be generous and kind to other people. So again, a couple of the guests we talked to, we're talking about that. We're talking about the way that these community groups in neighbourhoods had popped up, the way that people were looking out for their neighbours in ways that perhaps they hadn't always done, or perhaps hadn't recently done, and some of those things, and some of those community initiatives are just heartwarming. They're just amazing about how even in difficult times people are pulling together and trying to help each other. And if you're a community leader, a business leader, if you're involved in making decisions about how and where and when things happen, then I would really, really encourage you to think about, what is it that you've stopped doing, things you've stopped doing, or ways that you've stopped doing things because the pandemic forced you to, that you don't need to pick up again, that actually have happened because it was how we did things rather than because it was the best way to do it. Likewise, which things have you started to do new that the temptation will be to put them down when we return to whatever normal looks like, but actually that there will be a real gold mine in there to carry on those things. So for example, the offices, all the investment, all the time and money invested into office space, but I think some businesses will have to think about, or should think about, whether they repopulate those offices in the same way or at all. Likewise, churches, I've had conversations with church leaders or community leaders where their online activities have actually been more accessible for some people. So some people who physically couldn't get to an office, a place of worship or a community event, but were able to join in electronically, those people have often, not always, but those people have found that those events and those experiences more accessible. Of course, some people have been excluded who may not have been excluded previously, so people without the savvy or the resources for internet thing, and also the acknowledgement that electronic relationship is never going to replace physical relationship. Andy Campbell, it's been great talking to you over the 1 in 15 interviews and conversations. Uh, get over your trauma, deal with the hope, and live in that hope. Thanks.